Okay, part two, chapter 10, part two. So I've gone over the three kind of theoretical frames of the time period. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, ask a question. I've gone over transcendentalism, and that's it. So now we're going to talk about utopian communities. Utopia. Well, we don't have to get into it, but like, yeah, it's paradise, utopia. There's two ways in the Greek. There's a like little what looks like an E with a line over it and a U, and then there's another kind of way of writing it. One is like perfect, like eugenics is perfect genes. Um, that's not utopia. It's not the same root. It's nowhere. So in Thomas More's novel Utopia, he means a nowhere place. So the other U is nowhere. It's like nowhere place. Whatever. We don't. You want to geek out? Take the philosophy class. Okay, utopian communities. Again, turns out people don't like this stuff. Like environmental destruction, unbridled greed, like for all various reasons, people don't like it. Slavery, a lot of people don't like it. A lot of the resistance to what's happening in the world in this time period is rooted in either new political movements like socialism, for example, but that's not even close to the top. The main reason people are resistant to what they're seeing is religion. That like they've read the Bible, they read the book of Matthew, they know about Jesus, they're all about Protestantism, and they know that like greed, envy, like these things like are things that send you to hell. So not cool. So one of the ways that people respond is by forming various kinds of utopian communities, right? Communities that are supposed to respond to everything that they're seeing in the world. We're going to go very, very quickly here, right? Oneida, again, that's all you need to know. Weird sex stuff, top-notch silverware. They all have a weird, like, this is like what's the cult? The guy's going to jail right now forever, like, Nivexcus, what is it? And the cult leader, whatever. It's like Oneida, right? Not good. But in order to be self-sustaining, they start making silverware, and you can still buy Oneida silverware in, like, I don't know, Macy's or something like that. Again, the weird sex cult, that's a thing of the past. Shakers, also weird sex stuff, top-notch furniture. So for the Shakers, it's all about abstinence. Again, like, control your body, control your urges, control your mind, and then get right with God. And the issue, of course, being like, well, how are you going to find new members? You got to like, you got to like find recruits. Like, at what point do you tell the new recruits, like, yeah, abstinence? So doesn't really last. I mean, it lasts for actually significantly long enough time where like they're renowned for the furniture that they make, right? Shaker furniture is like museum piece, super expensive, very well made furniture. But again, you've got to have a model. You've got to have something to bring in revenue if you're going to try this weird utopian experiment. Mormonism. This is probably the most successful of all of them because it still exists, right? Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, formerly known as Mormonism. The idea being that Jesus, after he dies, comes back to the New World, walks around, meets with Native Americans or something. And we don't need to, it's not a theology class. We don't have to get into it here. They are very persecuted, right? Because it's seen as a kind of almost sacrilegious, right? If you're a Protestant Christian, it's a sacrilegious take on Christianity. They flee further and further west, eventually settling in like Salt Lake City, what is then Mexico. Remember, it's not just like the middle of nowhere, it's Mexico. Later, as the United States moves west and people start moving in, just like Native Americans, kill settlers. But that's not in, I don't think that's in our E-Push book. Wait till college to learn about that one. Fourierist, Fourier is the utopian socialist, one of the original socialists. This is before Marx. People think like socialism, Karl Marx. This is pre-Marx. People were socialists before Marx. The Fourier phalanxes are something that exists in France, these utopian communities, somewhat successful. some of them are successful in the United States. Brook Farm is not one of them. Brook Farm is the Fourierist commune or utopian community where all the transcendentalists go. Again, if you're sitting around like writing, poetry all day long or novels, you're not very good with like actually trying to like fix that wall, build that fence over there, plant these crops. They're not actually very good socialists, right? If you want to be a good socialist, you got to actually be like have calluses on your hands. The guys at Brook Farm are not. Fails. Owenite is one that's not in your book. Robert Owen. This again, he is a socialist and a capitalist. This is a guy who saw the kind of like environmental working conditions of various factories in England and said like, this doesn't seem right. Like child labor, bad working conditions, people dying on the job. And he came up with like, okay, let's have like free daycare and nursery school for children. So they're not working in the factory. They can be taken care of. Their mothers are happier. They can come to work. They don't have to worry about their kids. It's actually the first nursery school in England. So various other ways of like, let's pay higher wages, let's have job training programs, let's have events at night. And all of this was stuff that's commonplace now, right? In terms of like running a business, how do you make your employees happy? But it was radical at the time period, right? So like, how do you take ideas of socialist thought, integrate them into capitalist ideology and actually make a successful business? New Lanark in England is fairly successful. His venture in the United States, less so. There's other examples that's not in the book, and they're not on the College Board doesn't care, but there's like anarchist societies. There's other radical socialist societies. But these are the big ones. These are the big main highlight reel. Okay, urban culture. People are moving to cities. Because cities are good and living on a farm sucks, right? If you're young, you don't want to have to wake up at 4 a.m. every morning to like milk cows and light fires and do this, that, the other. This is largely in the north. If you're in the south and you're in slavery, you don't have to do any of that stuff because you have, right, enslaved laborers do it. But it's hard, right? If you're a free laborer or a yeoman farmer or freeholder or whatever, it's year to year. Very few farmers can kind of ferret away enough capital where they have money in the bank, right? As literally to, withstand a bad harvest or something. It's really year to year. So it's a lot better to just move to a city and like make money. Women move to cities and they get a lot of grief for just being women in cities. Right. So on the one hand, yes, sex work is a big part of urban culture in the 1820s, 1830s. Women who can't make wages, who don't make high enough wages otherwise, use sex work as a way to either supplement their income or just to make money, right? A way to make money. On the other hand, there's this term, we say prostitute, right? Prostitute is like a sex worker. But in this time period, it's very interesting because the term prostitute or to prostitute oneself would have been widely applied to any woman who was seen working in public. So not just like sex work, but women of the lower classes who had to go out and like work in factories, sell bread, or, go to the market and sell things or all that was considered like prostituting. And that's what the word they would have used, right? This idea of like going out into public and being a woman and making money somehow on your own was, right, prostitution. There's obviously a huge class element here that the people kind of leveling these charges were women and men who had enough money to not have to do that. If you were poorer, it wasn't an option. You had to go and either make money one way, shape, or form, either through selling stuff or actually through real, right, sex work. So that's something that the book makes a big deal of, and it's true because it is a major part of urban culture in this time period, and it's one of the reasons why the Second Great Awakening is wanting to try to bring people, women in particular, but also libidinous men, right? There's not just like there's two sides, takes two to tango, as they say, right? Bring them back into the church, teach them morals, etc., etc. Cities are seen as like dens of sin. And to that point, homosexuality and sociality are two things that emerge in cities in this time period. Obviously, like if you're down on the farm with your family and you're gay, you're going to have a hard life. You move to New York City and suddenly you can, right, actually be who you actually are. So it's still very taboo. We're not talking about, it's really not until the 1920s where like homosexuality becomes something, at least in cities, that is seen as normal or at least accepted by large portions of the city. Again, cities, not country. And then homosociality is also a part of this. This is places that are for just for men or just for women. And it's a place where it's not sexual desire, but it's kind of like you know, like a bromance if you're a guy, or whatever the feminine equivalent of a bromance is. I don't know if that exists, does it? In this time period, it's social clubs, both for men and women, where you can go and you can kind of, be a man's man or a woman's woman amongst your peers. And for men, there's blood sports and brothels, right? So blood sport is like dog fighting. I think your book mentions rat fighting. I think maybe if you're don't have a lot of money in the bank account, maybe you go to the rat fight. If you're doing a little bit better for yourself, you go to the dog fight or the cockfight. This was common in rural America too. Bull baiting, bear fighting, all of this just awful stuff was very like homosocial environments where it was like men. Like if you've seen the movie Fight Club, then you understand what homosociality is. That's what it's all about. And then of course brothels. Brothels are places where, right, sex work existed, but it's all about men being men in that space, right? Minstrel shows. Minstrel shows are probably the most popular form of entertainment in this time period. The theater is a really, really big deal in the United States in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. So much so that like in was it 1849, the Astor Place riots, and there's an Astor Place theater in New York City where Astor Place is now, if you know New York. And it's a huge riot. I think 50, 60 some people are killed. Like the most people are killed like in a crowd action since the revolution. And it's a riot basically because the old school nativists liked a certain actor to play the lead role in a play who was like an old school nativist, Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And the newly arrived like Irish immigrants liked a different lead, right? Another like the rival actor who was more like Jacksonian and immigrant, like, and they went at it. And they killed like 60 people died. Anyway, the theater is a big deal, and no more form of theater than the minstrel show. This is to say, white people blacking up, putting on shoe polish or cork or whatever. So I've lost my shoe here, and I want to try to put my shoe back on, but I can't find it. I also need to I think my F-Lux. This has happened once before where I've lectured late into the night, and my again, I think you all call it flux, but it's not flux, it's F-Lux, disable for an hour. F.lux is F-Lux as far as I'm concerned. Okay, minstrel shows. So this is like, it's racist, okay? It is, blacking up, performing like in a kind of minstrel, very racist, caricature-y kind of way. This is the standard trope for when we talk about the Jim Crow era after the Civil War, Jim Crow laws. That term comes from one of the most famous minstrel characters, Jim Crow, who had this whole like, what was it? Wheel about, turn about, do just so. And every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. Like that's the song. So the white guy blacks up and does a little song and dance. It's racist. Very, very popular, in particular popular among newly arrived Irish and working class whites. There's all kinds of like 301, 401 history on this about why it was so popular with them. The dominant historical theory is that the minstrel show showed the newly arrived Irish like they could laugh at something that was actually really, really close to home. The singing, the dancing, the drinking, the poorly spoken English, like all of these things were things that they themselves were targeted, right, as being like as personifying, but they could look at someone blacked up doing it and they could laugh at it and say, oh, look at these, black people, how backwards they are. And it gave them the ability to kind of like distance, right, the things that they actually really like were central to their cultural identity, but to like look at it and say, oh, point the finger at another, whatever. That's the dominant theory, at least at this point in the historiography. Very, very popular, very, very popular, and it will continue to be popular up until, I mean, it's Halloween now. I mean, I guess, what is it, the 29th, right now. Halloween is a couple days away. People are going to be blacking up. Idiots, morons, fools, people who like, look, I could have told you in 1830 that it was racist to black up. We don't need to wait till 2020. So don't wear blackface. If you're going to learn anything from APUSH, like this is the lowest of low bars. Don't black up. Big popular thing in the 1830s. A lot of stuff that happened in the 1830s, not cool anymore. That's one of them. P.T. Barnum, also speaking of things that are not cool anymore, this is not the like greatest like entertainer or whatever, Hugh Jackman, whatever. I didn't see the movie, but I don't imagine it involved like dwarves and freaks and other kind of one of the most famous, the thing that made P.T. Barnum the most famous was he had an elderly, very, very old black woman in his show who he said was the nurse or the mammy of George Washington. And people would come to pay money to see this very, very elderly black woman. And when she died, he charged money to have people come in and watch a public autopsy of her body. So like that's what P.T. Barnum is up to. So it's not just like, I don't know what's in The Great Entertainer, but I don't imagine that's in The Great Entertainer. Other kind of hoaxes and curiosities, right? There was this thing where it was like the bottom half of a fish, like a tuna or something, and the front half was like a dehydrated monkey, and they'd sewn it together, and it was like this mermaid or whatever. It's just like freak show stuff, right? This is stuff that is really popular in the time period, and P.T. Barnum in cities, this is how he makes his, right? This is his claim to fame early on. Okay, so abolition. This is the next big. So we go from cities, right, and we have urban culture. P.T. Barnum, all that, into the biggest movement of the time period, which is abolition. Obviously, the parallels to our current moment are many. In terms of demands for civil rights, people have made the comparison to the civil rights movement and the current movement for in Black Lives Matter. The parallel is there. It's very obvious, and it's also very obvious to connect it back to these kind of cyclical trends for demands for civil rights, which emerge in American history periodically and have never actually been adequately addressed, hence why we're still having this conversation. Okay, so some background. Not everyone is enslaved. Not every black person in the United States is enslaved in this time period. There are free black communities in the North and in the South. They are fairly small. They are socially marginalized. They're insular. They're kind of, right, shut off from the larger world to some extent. Economically precarious. Their citizenship status is always kind of in a legal gray area. One of the major things that they do is they found their own church, the American Methodist Episcopal Church, 1816. The first parish actually is in Charleston, South Carolina. It's also apropos of Black Lives Matter. It is the site of the where white supremacist Dylann Roof white supremacist twerp Dylan Roof shot up the church in, I think, 2016, killed a bunch of black parishioners. No coincidence why the Emmanuel AME in Charleston was a target, because it's a site of black independence and black freedom for so long. They do try to secure respectability from white communities, and this is like, there's a lot of contemporary talk, if you understand social movements, about respectability politics and whether one, social movement should follow respectability politics or not. Look, it's 1820. People want to be considered respectable by the larger community, and that's exactly what is happening in this time period with free blacks. Is they're trying to be they're not trying to be white, but they're trying to just fit in as much as possible, and that is what respectability politics is all about. However, Nat Turner, he's not a free black American. He is enslaved in Virginia. The book says something or other about like, oh, his family and some friends. It's like, it's a big group of enslaved laborers that he marshals and organizes, and they have a insurgency that is just the most classic case study of the 1830s and 40s. It's nothing new. We learned about the Stono Rebellion, we learned about the Haitian Revolution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I will point out, just as a kind of to think back now that I'm talking about the Haitian Revolution, it reminds me how the book took some pains to point out that Toussaint Louverture was formerly held slaves. Out of all of the things that you could say about the Haitian Revolution in a paragraph, that they found that was necessary. Similarly, with free black communities, the book goes to some lengths to say that some free blacks also held slaves. Although this was rare, they say, although not so rare where they didn't mention it. Again, there's a politics to this. If you have two paragraphs on free black communities, and you don't mention all of the fundraising that they do to emancipate people, or manumit, or their work in abolition, or any other number of things that you could say about free black communities, but you do mention that some people actually held slaves, that's a little sus. So anyway, just reminded me as I was talking about the Toussaint Louverture, kind of the ways in which like little dribs and drabs of garbage come into our book. Back to someone who is not messing around, Nat Turner. 55 some whites are killed. He thinks that God has spoken to him, just like any number of religious leaders in this time period. Joseph Smith and others think God is speaking to them. God speaks to Nat Turner. He's a charismatic kind of preacher, and he scares the crap out of Southerners, Virginia in particular, because that's where the uprising is. The interesting thing about Nat Turner is that it's a turning point in terms of the South cracking down on enslaved. No more reading, no more teaching people to read. They can't do their own preaching, all of things that Nat Turner did. The book points out that I think something like 40% of the Virginia legislature, however, did vote to start a process of gradual abolition and compensated manumission. That's a significant 40% of Virginia didn't go that way. The 60% wins, and the slave laws get harsher and harsher and harsher. Of course, Southerners don't think that enslaved people are capable of this. They blame abolitionists, Northerners. Black abolitionists, the highlight reel. Frederick Douglass, huge lecturer on the Lyceum circuit, and he is one of the most popular, and still to this day, probably the most famous black abolitionists. Harriet Tubman being the other one. Underground Railroad leads many enslaved workers to freedom, not in the North, but in Canada. The only real guarantee for freedom was Canada. That's why Frederick Douglass and Tubman are both located in Rochester, New York, which is close to Niagara Falls, which is just across the way from Canada. In the 1960s, Malcolm X famously or infamously said that everything south of Canada was Mississippi. effectively saying that Jim Crow is everywhere, right? That black people don't have civil rights anywhere in the United States. You've got to get to Canada. And that's 1960. In the 1820s, 30s, 40s, people like Douglas and Tubman understood that unless you got to Canada, you could always be pulled back into slavery. David Walker, Walker's Appeal is a famous radical call for abolition. It's widely read, and he's widely influential over many other black abolitionists and white abolitionists. White abolitionists, briefly here, and I'll mention a little bit more. Well, I guess I'll say it all on this slide. Yeah, it's all crammed all in here. Just because you're an abolitionist doesn't mean you're not what we would call a racist, right? So the ACS is American Colonization Society. Colonization means like, okay, get rid of slavery and send all the black people to Africa or back to Africa, right? As racists in 1820 or in 2020 would like to say, right? Go back to where you came from. Even though people, this is someone like they've been here since the 17th century. They're certainly more American than a newly arrived immigrant. ACS is an abolitionist society, but it's a moderate one, right? End slavery, send black people to Africa, back to Africa. The American Anti-Slavery Society, more radical. That is William Lloyd Garrison. Is the American Anti-Slavery Society, who you see, I'm over Garrison here. I think I've actually put too much on this slide, and we might not be able to get the poor Grimke sisters on here. I apologize to them. Let's see. I don't know. We're all over the place now. William Lloyd Garrison, radical. He's white. He has audiences that are both black and white mixed together, and he burns a copy of the Constitution on the Capitol steps on 4th of July. Pretty radical for the 1820s. Grimke sisters are here. We have an image of them at least. I think I've cut them off from the bottom because I've tried to put too much on the slide. Grimke sisters born in South Carolina. They convert to Quakerism, move north, and are radical abolitionists. Just goes to show that you do not choose your parents, but you do choose your politics. They're born into a family of enslavers. They don't take it as a given that that's just normal. They realize it's actually not normal, and they go and become very famous abolitionists in the North. Not everyone is happy about this. Anti-abolitionist policies are normal, right? And again, I put this little thought experiment up here, not to antagonize anyone, but we all want to be the abolitionists. We all say, had I been back there, I'd have been I'd have been in the Lyceum circuit, and I would have been fighting for it. Slavery is wrong. Clearly it's wrong. What were people thinking? Or I would have been marching, arm in arm with Martin Luther King or whatever. No, you wouldn't have. You wouldn't have. Statistically speaking, you would not have. 10% of Northerners are actually support abolition. That's a really small minority of Americans. Way less than people who support Black Lives Matter. And you see the grief that people give Black Lives Matter. Again, have we learned nothing from the past? You see the kind of grief that movement gets. Same thing's happening here, except they're even less popular, way less popular in the 1820s, 1830s. Majority of people, 90% chance you would have been pro-slavery. Or me, I'm not immune to this either. But it pays to, when we're thinking historically and thinking about our current moment, how do we draw connections between the past and the present? Certainly, if we project ourselves into the past, those are the stats. And why is this? Social movements are always unpopular. People like to, civil rights, Martin Luther King, yay. People didn't like Martin Luther King. Majority of Americans, white Americans, didn't like Martin Luther King. Majority of white Americans, overwhelming majority of white Americans, did not support abolition. If everyone, or if a majority of people supported these movements, they wouldn't be movements. They would just be normal stuff, right? This is the kind of tension of democracy, is that just because 51% of the people support something doesn't mean that it's right? And abolition suffrage, women's rights, anti-child labor campaigns, workplace safety laws, accommodations for people with disabilities. There's any number of social movements through American history where we look back on them and we, right, yay, aren't we proud of, but like had a majority of Americans supported them, they wouldn't be social movements. They'd just been like rubber stamped laws that everyone agreed with. Anyway, why do people not like abolition? A number of reasons. Constitutional argument, enslaved people are private property. The Federalist argument is states' rights to slavery. The economic argument is job competition. This is white Northerners saying, look, you abolish slavery and suddenly all these formerly enslaved workers come north. They compete for wages. They're used to being paid no wages. So obviously they'll accept a lower wage. And then there's just like the most kind of like patently obvious example, which is just like, I'm a racist. I don't like black people. Right. And I have these four kind of justifications for anti-abolition for a reason, to point out this is the one that we think about the most. Oh, people were just bad people. They're just racist. And they justify being racist by just being racist. That is a kind of individualized form of racism, right? That it's all about the individual, right? Saying, this is my personal choice. The other four forms are examples of structural racism. If I'm making an argument that is pro-slavery and I'm all about private property, states' rights, federalism, job competition, where is the racism in the argument? I mean, everywhere? Nowhere? Somewhere? I mean, where does it, it's like a shell game. Like you go to a baseball game and in the seventh inning, they have the little hats and they put the little ball under it and they move them around or whatever. That's exactly what's happening here. Where is the racism? That is structural racism, right? So the idea that like you can actually advance an argument that is anti-black, that is pro-slavery without necessarily having to be anti-black, points to structural racism. Here you have the right outrage, fellow citizens. I mean, this is like basically like, come on out and beat down the abolitionists. The Union forever, right? Again, evoking this kind of notion of patriotism because abolitionists were seen as anti-American, right? That it was, again, you're against the Constitution, you're against states' rights, you're against free market economics, whatever. Historical losers right here, right? Historical losers, anti-abolitionists, people who wanted to maintain slavery, maintain racial hierarchy, losers because they lost. And they always lose. Women's rights, the last major social movement, which is very, very important and one of the defining movements of the time period. Rewind the clock back, context paragraph style. Republican motherhood is the ideology of the founding generation. This is women educating children how to be good Republican citizens, taking care of the family. Where do you go from there? Obviously, once you've like filled that role to its fullest, you have to say, well, what next? For a lot of women, it's the vote. For other women, it's more recognition of their or allowance for them to have roles in public, all this stuff. One of the interesting things here is that the Great Awakening, in its return to religious values, actually gives women more control over their bodies, in the sense that like the irreligious time period of the 18 teens right into the 20s is one in which a lot of women, as your book points out, right, it's like 80% of marriages, there's a kid within the first 8 months. Well, do the math on that, right? Why are people getting married, right? Because a woman is pregnant. So the idea that this isn't like, we're not quite to debates about contraception yet, but it is a way of like, okay, by being by not engaging in sex before marriage, right? This is a way for women to, right, empower themselves and have control over their own bodies. So that is a way in which the Great Awakening actually does empower. Religion empowers women to take control over their own bodies. they want more education. Women are demanding more education because, again, you can be a better Republican mother or daughter or citizen if you're smarter, right? This is going to give you more freedom, both in terms of your role in society. It's also going to give you more freedom in terms of like who you're going to marry. If you have access to education and you're smart and you have some kind of like ambition in life and you have a role in society, you're not going to marry some loser, right? If you don't have access to education, that's all you got. Like you got what you get. The horizon of your world ends where a man's gaze begins, right? Looking at you, like wanting to marry you. That sucks. So for women, education is a way of like, nah, like, no, 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 right? Weeding through the losers of life and saying like, okay, I can actually have freedom. I can be happy. I can marry someone who's my intellectual equal, etc. So education is a big part of all this. Mariah, it's not Maria, it's Mariah Stewart, pictured at right here, African-American woman who demanded equality not only for women but also for black women, which was like very radical in the time period. It's one thing for Seneca Falls women to be demanding the vote or whatever, they're upper middle class white women. For a black woman to be demanding equality was like, right? This is like intersectionality, 19th century style. She's marginalized because she's a woman. She's marginalized because she's black. So she is kind of doubly marked. She is one of the kind of prime movers of this movement, right, of women's rights in this time period. Very influenced by David Walker's radicalism in Walker's Appeal. William Lloyd Garrison is kind of instrumental in getting her published in his magazine or his periodical, The Liberator. And she speaks to mixed gender and mixed race audiences, which again, like you can't imagine, really, really radical for the time period. Again, just like prostitute to prostitute oneself, or like corruption or condescension have all these different meanings if we use them in the early to mid 19th century. So does promiscuity. She would have been labeled promiscuous because if you look up the dictionary definition of promiscuous, it means like not discerning and like the stuff you do, whatever it may be, right? So we generally think of promiscuity has to do with sexual relations. But in this time period, it could have been just like hanging out with people of another gender or another race. It's like not being discerning enough. Very, very influential. And I'm very glad that your book mentions her, because I think often in American history textbooks, she's actually not mentioned. She's a very important figure in the early push for women's rights. The big one, obviously, is Seneca Falls. Can't forget this. Declaration of Sentiments mirrors the Declaration of Independence. Similar language in the introduction to kind of like preface to the whole thing, and a list of demands as well. Very much, right? The women knew what they were doing. Headed up by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. 1848. This is the beginning of what we would call first wave feminism, as opposed to second or third or now fourth wave feminism. This is any wave of feminism is women saying we want equality, not super radical position to actually hold here. Like we are human beings that should be treated as equal, not marginalized and subjugated to the will of another person. And Seneca Falls is the big one here. A lot of people deem the what kind of suffragettes, right, to use another kind of condescending term, or the women demanding rights and the vote or suffrage as nonsense, right? This is nonsense, right? They don't know what they're doing. It's kind of like foolish. Even think back to that John Adams primary source, the John Adams and Abigail Adams exchange that we saw, where John Adams, his response is very condescending and dismissive. Compare that. This is interesting. Compare how, again, this is a minoritarian position. Majority of Americans do not support women's rights. Majority of Americans do not support abolition. Both of those movements are minoritarian, right? A minority of Americans support them, not racial or gender minorities, but like fewer than 50%, like way fewer, like 10, 20. But look at the rhetoric around the two. Abolition is dangerous, threatening, anti-American. It is something that is like very, very much like, right, beware, it's Nat Turner, right? Give African Americans freedom, and before you know it, it's, you know, white people's heads on pikes. It's Nat Turner. It is the worst thing imaginable. It's the Haitian Revolution, right? That is the rhetoric that a lot of white Americans use to dismiss abolition. The rhetoric that is used to dismiss women's rights is nonsense, right? Foolish, right? That it's ridiculous, that they're like, you know, it's a very important distinction because it's the difference between how a group demanding racial equality is marginalized as a dangerous, violent threat versus how women demanding gender or sex equality are marginalized, which is like, you know, it's a joke, right? It's laughable. It's nonsense. That distinction is very, very important, and sadly, it's one that continues on into our current moment. The way in which people respond to women's rights movements in the 21st century is dismissive, nonsense, right? It's a joke, versus, right, violent, radical, terrorist, extremist, right, civil rights organizations. If only you could learn, if only you could, there was some way to look at history and figure out what was the right answer. Too bad there isn't. If there was only some discipline that you could look at and study and try to say, well, what happened back then, and what should we do now? Anyway, maybe we'll figure that out at some point in the future. Until then, keep plugging away at it. I'll see you in chapter 11.